Most people know about the American involvement in the Vietnam War, the protests, and the terrible battles. But not many talk about the horrifying things done by the Viet Cong. These were not just soldiers fighting for their country. They also carried out brutal war crimes that left behind fear, pain, and scars that have never healed. The Viet Cong, officially known as the National Liberation Front, was a communist group that operated mainly in South Vietnam during the Vietnam War. They were formed in December 1960 with strong support and direction from the North Vietnamese government in Hanoi. The main goal was to overthrow the South Vietnamese government, which they saw as corrupt and backed by foreign powers, mainly the United States. The Viet Cong wanted to reunite North and South Vietnam under a single communist rule, following the ideas of Ho Chi Minh, the communist leader of North Vietnam. At first, many of their fighters were not professional soldiers. They were just ordinary people who believed they were fighting for independence and justice. Some joined because they were promised land or a better future. Others were forced to join under threats or violence. Many young men and women were recruited or pressured to fight, even if they didn't fully understand what the war was about. The Viet Cong became known for using guerrilla warfare. They didn't wear uniforms like regular armies. They blended in with the local population and used thick jungles and rural villages to hide and launch surprise attacks. At the start, they were praised by some as brave rebels fighting against foreign control. But over time, their methods became more and more extreme. One of the most terrifying things the Viet Cong did during the war was go after regular people, especially anyone they believed was connected to the South Vietnamese government or the United States. These weren't soldiers. They were normal civilians just trying to live their lives. But to the Viet Cong, if you were even slightly involved with the government, you were considered the enemy. They didn't care if you were helping people, if you were a school teacher teaching students under the government system, or a doctor working in a government clinic. You could be marked for death. Village leaders, police officers, government clerks, and even mail carriers were at risk. In many cases, farmers were targeted just for giving food or shelter to South Vietnamese troops or American soldiers. The Viet Cong usually attacked at night. They would sneak into villages silently, sometimes dressed like civilians. They would knock on doors or break them down and drag people out of their homes in front of their families. These people were taken into the jungle or deep into rural areas. Many never came back. Days or weeks later, their bodies would be found in fields, on riverbanks, or dumped in shallow graves. Some victims had been tortured. Their hands and feet were tied with wire. Their faces were swollen and beaten. Some were shot in the head, while others were stabbed or hacked with machetes. A few were even buried alive. In some cases, they were forced to dig their own graves before being killed. It was meant to scare everyone who saw or heard about it. The fear was so strong that in some areas, no one dared to speak to South Vietnamese soldiers or American troops, even if they wanted to help. Parents told their kids to stay silent. Villagers would turn their backs when government workers passed by. Everyone knew that the Viet Cong could come at any time, and they did. In 1967, one of the most horrifying massacres carried out by the Vietnam happened in Quang Nam province, located in central Vietnam. This area had many small villages where people tried to live quietly, growing rice and taking care of their families. But because Quang Nam was a place with both South Vietnamese and American military presence, the Viet Cong believed that many locals were secretly helping the enemy. One night, a group of heavily armed Viet Cong fighters entered a peaceful village in Quang Nam. It was dark and most people were asleep when the fighters began going house to house. They forced families outside at gunpoint, yelling that the villagers were traitors for talking to American soldiers or working with the South Vietnamese government. Many of the people they targeted had never been involved in anything political. Some were just farmers or parents trying to survive the war. The Viet Cong didn't give anyone a chance to explain. There were no trials, no questions, just brutal punishment. They tied people up, beat them, and dragged them away. Then they began killing them. The violence was so extreme that even children were not spared. Out of the 74 people killed, 23 were just kids, some of them babies. Entire families were wiped out in a single night. What made this even worse was how the bodies were treated. The Viet Cong tied some of the victims together with rope or wire and dumped them into deep village wells. Others were left on the ground, covered in blood, as a warning to the rest of the villagers. After the massacre, people in nearby villages heard about what happened and were terrified. Many stopped talking to government workers or soldiers. Some even moved away, hoping to avoid being next. One of the most shocking and brutal moments of the Vietnam War happened during the Tet Offensive in early 1968. This was a huge surprise attack planned by both the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army. It began on January 30th, 1968 during the Tet holiday, which is the Vietnamese New Year, a time when people were supposed to be celebrating with their families. Instead, war suddenly exploded in cities all across South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive was meant to catch the US and South Vietnamese forces off guard. The Viet Cong attacked over 100 cities and towns all at once. One of the most important battles took place in the city of Hue, a peaceful city in central Vietnam known for its culture, history, and old buildings. At first, Hue wasn't expecting to be hit so hard, but soon it became the center of one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. When the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces took control of Hue, they stayed there for about 3.5 weeks, killing innocent people in the same way, dragging them out of their homes, and murdering them in brutal ways. When U.S. Marines and South Vietnamese forces finally took back Hue in late February 1968, they made a horrifying discovery. All around the city, in gardens, rice fields, and hidden pits, they started finding mass graves. Many of the people had been tied up, blindfolded, and shot in the head. Others were beaten to death or buried alive. Some showed signs of torture, with broken bones, crushed skulls, and missing body parts. In many cases, entire families were buried together. Over 2,800 bodies were officially found, but people who lived there believed the true number was closer to 5,000. The Tet Offensive overall failed in military terms. The Viet Cong lost tens of thousands of fighters, but the psychological impact was huge. It showed the war wasn't close to being over, and it made many Americans lose hope. What happened in Hue in 1968 was more than just a battle. It was a planned purge. The Viet Cong didn't just show up and kill at random. They came with hit lists, carefully prepared ahead of time with the names of people the Viet Cong wanted to eliminate. These names were gathered by local communist informers, spies, and agents who had been living quietly in Hue, pretending to be ordinary citizens. Some had spent years collecting information about who worked for the South Vietnamese government, who had ties to the US, and who might resist a communist takeover. When the Viet Cong took over the city during the Tet Offensive, they brought out the lists and started going after people one by one. Their goal was to completely wipe out anyone who could stand in their way, anyone with a voice, a role, or even an education. Some people were arrested for just owning a radio, which was seen as a tool for listening to enemy propaganda. Others were executed for having books, for being able to speak English, or simply because they had worked for a government office. Even people who had done charity work or helped build schools were seen as threats. And people who had no real connection to the government were killed simply because someone reported them, whether the accusation was true or not. If a neighbor had a grudge or wanted revenge, they could falsely accuse someone, and the Viet Cong would take that person away without asking any questions. Many innocent lives were lost because of lies and personal hatred. The Viet Cong were known for their guerrilla tactics, but one of the most dangerous and cruel things they did was use booby traps and landmines, not just to fight enemy soldiers, but in ways that hurt innocent people too. These traps didn't care who they hit. They killed and injured thousands of civilians. The Viet Cong planted these traps everywhere: rice fields, jungle paths, village roads, and even school routes were filled with hidden dangers. People living in the countryside were constantly at risk. Just walking to fetch water or going to work in the fields could end in tragedy. One of the most common and feared traps was the Punji Stake Pit. This was a shallow hole dug into the ground and filled with sharp bamboo spikes. The tips of the spikes were often coated with human feces to cause deadly infections when someone got stabbed. The hole would be covered with leaves or grass, so it looked like normal ground. And when someone stepped on it, they'd fall in and get impaled by the spikes. Even if the person survived the fall, the wounds were usually deep, definitely painful, and almost always got infected. Another terrifying trap was the Bouncing Betty mine, a type of explosive that would shoot up into the air when triggered, then explode at chest height, sending metal pieces flying into the body. These were meant to hit multiple people at once and cause massive injuries. The Viet Cong also used tripwire grenades, explosive cans, and spike-filled swinging logs that would slam into whoever opened a door or walked into a narrow trail. They even got creative with household items, rigging up toys, bicycles, and food containers to explode when touched. Some traps were placed in water wells or near village entrances, places where people naturally gathered. The purpose wasn't just to kill soldiers, it was to scare the entire population. They wanted people to feel unsafe everywhere, even in their own homes and farms. Between 1964 and 1973, it's estimated that more than 65,000 South Vietnamese civilians were either killed or seriously injured by landmines and booby traps. Even after the war ended, these traps kept hurting people. Unexploded landmines and hidden punji pits remained in the ground for years. Farmers would step on old mines while planting crops. Children playing outside would trigger old explosives. The damage didn't stop just because the fighting ended. The Cu Chi tunnels were one of the Viet Cong's most secret and dangerous weapons during the war. Located just northwest of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, this area became famous for its huge network of underground tunnels. These tunnels stretched for over 150 miles, twisting through the jungle and deep into the ground. They weren't just narrow crawl spaces. They were like hidden cities below the surface. The Viet Cong used the tunnels to move secretly, store weapons, hide from bombings, and launch surprise attacks. But what many people don't know is that these tunnels were also used for brutal torture and killing. When American or South Vietnamese soldiers were captured by the Viet Cong, some of them were dragged into these tunnels as prisoners. Inside, it was dark, damp, and filled with insects and rats. There was barely any air to breathe, and the narrow space made escape almost impossible. Prisoners were kept in tiny underground cages, barely big enough to sit in, with no light and very little food or water. The Viet Cong often tortured prisoners for information. They would beat them, shock them, stab them, or tie them up for days without food. Some were hung by their arms or legs until their joints dislocated. Others were burned or cut with knives. Many were kept alive just long enough to suffer. Screams could often be heard coming from the tunnels, but there was no one to help. Some prisoners were eventually buried alive, especially if the Viet Cong thought they were too dangerous to release. Others simply died from starvation, from disease, or injuries from the torture. The tunnels were so deep and well hidden that it was hard for U.S. or South Vietnamese troops to find or rescue anyone trapped inside. There are stories of prisoners who spent weeks or even months in those tunnels before dying. They were never officially recorded, and many families never found out what happened to their loved ones. After the war, when the tunnels were explored, bones and remains were found in secret compartments and hidden chambers. Even today, the Cu Chi tunnels have sections open to tourists, but what visitors usually see is only a small part of the full picture. Women also suffered horribly. The Viet Cong didn't only fight soldiers. In many cases, they used rape and sexual violence as weapons to spread fear and punish communities. In villages suspected of helping the South Vietnamese government or the Americans, the Viet Cong would often raid homes late at night. During these raids, young women and teenage girls were often dragged out of their homes. Some were taken away into the jungle and never seen again. Families would search for them for days, weeks, or months, but most were never found. The truth is that many were raped and killed, their bodies dumped in the woods or hidden in the rivers. In other cases, the cruelty happened right there in front of families. Some women were raped in front of their parents, their husbands, or their children. It was done to shame the family, to break their spirit. After the assault, some women were executed on the spot, while others were taken as prisoners and later killed. These crimes were deeply traumatic. Most victims were too afraid to speak out. In Vietnamese culture, honor and shame are very important, and many survivors stayed silent for years. They didn't want to be judged, blamed, or rejected by their communities. But that silence doesn't mean the crimes didn't happen. Over time, some brave women have come forward. They've told their stories. These were not rare events. In some provinces, especially in central and southern Vietnam, reports of sexual violence by the Viet Cong were common during and after major attacks. Places like Quang Ngai, Binh Dinh, and Mekong Delta saw multiple cases of women being taken and abused during village raids. In many cases, the Viet Cong used rape not only as a punishment, but as a way to control and dominate. They believed that by attacking women, they could destroy the heart of the community. Sadly, these crimes were often left out of the history books, especially during the Cold War, when both sides of the conflict tried to control the narrative. Some didn't want to believe the Viet Cong could do such things. Others were too scared to bring attention to it. The Viet Cong often used children as tools in the war. Some were forced to carry bombs or act as spies. Others were brainwashed into killing their own neighbors. In some cases, young boys were forced to kill their own fathers to prove their loyalty to the Viet Cong. These children were robbed of their childhoods and turned into weapons. In 1971, in the village of Dak Son, about 100 kilometers from Saigon, the Viet Cong carried out one of the most evil acts of the war. They attacked the village with flamethrowers, burning down houses and killing hundreds of civilians. Many victims were trapped inside their homes. Over 250 people died, including women and babies. The flames turned the village into ashes, and survivors were left with nothing. By the time the war ended in 1975, the Viet Cong had committed countless war crimes. While the world often focuses on the mistakes of American soldiers during the war, many of the Viet Cong's actions have been ignored or forgotten. But for those who lived through it, the pain remains.